Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So, as someone that has a background in cybersecurity, whenever I hear someone make the argument under the guise of think of the children, my ears instantly perk up because I know for almost certain that what they're really pushing for is an elimination of privacy, because time and time again, we've seen this argument be pushed for things like removing end-to-end encryption, and in this case today that we're talking about, age verification on the internet. If it were that simple that it was think of the children, then yes, that would be very fine, and I think you'd get most people on board, which is, obviously why you'd want to throw that argument where you can. But the problem is when you use it as a crutch to try to push through something that would undoubtedly make everyone else's lives significantly worse, that's where I think we have to kind of draw the line. So, and because it's been used so frequently in these kinds of, shall we say, scenarios that don't necessarily warrant it, and it's maybe like, yes, technically that is true, but there's also this other big thing that you're overlooking. It's worth kind of diving in deeper too. So this week there was a recent article put out by The Verge, basically going over the adoption of age verification on various sites around the internet. And for what it's worth, some of the websites that they reference, it does seem reasonable that you would kind of want age verification on the sites. But the reality is, it's just a privacy nightmare and a ticking time bomb of thousands, if not millions of people having their identities stolen, because it's only a matter of time before one of these websites that is required to have age verification on it gets hacked, and then whatever information was used for the age verification, most likely something like a driver's license or some other kind of photo ID, that gets leaked in a database somewhere. Then threat actors get a hold of that, and they can now basically steal your information pretty darn easily. But that's also not even to mention the fact that if you have to verify yourself with your ID, any snippet or any little bit of privacy you might have had is absolutely gone at that point. Because sure, you can, make a username that doesn't, resemble your name at all. You could make a burner email account, for instance. You could always connect through a VPN or Tor. But the second you have to upload an actual piece of identification about yourself, you're absolutely done at that point. So any sort of privacy is gone, and any actions you take in that account can obviously be traced immediately back to you. So we're going to kind of get into some of the other reasons later on in this episode, but that's kind of a bit of a tidbit of what's coming up. But before we get into that, let's start off with our trivia question for the week. So this week's trivia question is: when CrowdStrike took down the internet last year, it was due to a bad configuration file update to their endpoint detection and response agent, which caused widespread blue screens of death on Windows machines. But what was the name of that agent software? So what was the name of CrowdStrike software that caused the blue screen of death across all of the Microsoft Windows machines last year? And that is your trivia question for the week. Speaking of CrowdStrike, let's move into this week's cybersecurity tip. Now, this week's cybersecurity tip technically has absolutely nothing to do with CrowdStrike, but since CrowdStrike is a cybersecurity company, I figured it was a semi-smooth transition. But anyway, this week's cybersecurity tip is to implement a software bill of materials. So just like when you go to the grocery store, whatever kind of cadence you typically go, I think a week is probably typically common for most people. Some people go more frequently than that, some go less. But when you go to the grocery store, typically you'll have some kind of list for things that you need to buy from the grocery store. So you're basically documenting what you need to pick up so you remember to actually get everything. So the idea of a software bill of materials is very similar. So just like when you're going to the grocery store, you document things you need to restock your fridge or your pantry, you can do the same thing with your computer system. So anything that you have running on the system is something that you should be documenting. So for instance, what operating system it's running, what kind of services you're running. So for instance, if you're running like a Pi-hole server, probably running Linux, so which kind of Linux distro you're using, the version number, and then obviously Pi-hole and the version of Pi-hole would be ideal. But at the very least, just kind of having what software you have. And the reason why it's so important is because the more detailed you can be about what software is running on your various systems, the easier it is to detect when you have too much running on a given system. Because one of the issues with having a single system having multiple services on it is you drastically increase your attack surface that someone could theoretically use to exploit that particular machine and get into it and then potentially take you down through some kind of lateral movement or just seriously harm that machine. And depending on what all is on there, that could obviously vary in degrees of severity. So you always want to make sure that you're essentially a principle of least privilege in a way, but just making sure you reduce your attack surface as much as possible and only installing what you need on the system to minimize your attack surface. So the nice thing about coming up with a bill of materials in this case for software is if you document each one of your systems and what's running on it, it makes it a lot easier for you to be on the lookout for vulnerabilities when they creep up. So for instance, if you know that I know I'm picking on Pi-hole here, but that's just because it's what's on the top of my mind right now. If you run Pi-hole, in your home lab, for instance, and you notice that there is a vulnerability out for Pi-hole, then you know that, hey, I need to make sure that I patch Pi-hole as soon as a patch comes out because I run that in my home lab. But if you don't have a software bill of materials and you just kind of forget what you have installed on some of your machines, you're more likely to miss certain updates and patches when they come out for pieces of software you have that are vulnerable. So it makes it a lot easier to track specific projects that you have running in your infrastructure in case there are any vulnerabilities that creep up on them. And then, of course, because you're following those updates, it makes it a lot easier to know when you should be patching your systems. But again, if you're using something like a Linux distro, and you install the package through like your package manager, as long as you're doing like your routine, package updates for everything, you're probably pretty good. But there are, of course, other pieces of software that don't get installed via the package manager, in which case you have to be a little more diligent making sure you install those updates. Another thing would be like Docker containers. Those obviously don't self-update themselves. You have to kind of manually do that. Now, of course, you can automate the process of updating your Docker containers. I do that. But the point still remains that they don't just kind of update themselves. Like certain operating systems, you can have, you basically can enable like auto patching. So whenever there's like new updates for the operating system, like during inactive hours, it'll basically update itself for you, so you don't really have to worry about it too much. But there, of course, are still things that you do need to make sure you manually update. So having a software bill of materials can help you identify what pieces of software you have and make sure that everything you're running is currently up to date and if there are any patches that you need. So yeah, that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Making sure you have a bill of materials for the software that you run in your infrastructure. So then, moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I didn't finish anything, but I at least got a good start on some things. So recently, I guess the most recent big task, I guess you could say, for the Pokemon video game project I'm making is creating the bag menu. And in the bag menu, when you click on an item, there's like this 2x2 grid essentially where you can pick your options. And I realized that I already had other instances where I was one printing out 2x2 grids or basically columned items, and I also had instances where I had literally the same instance, like in the battle screen. So, like when you're in the middle of a battle, selecting which move you want to use, or selecting which option to do. Fight, run, bag, run, Pokemon, etc. So I already had this code implemented, but I needed to figure out a way to kind of bring it into the bag menu. And that's, of course, where I realized that basically was creating a different solution for every single one of those instances, which obviously is not ideal and very bad practice. So I decided to put an end to that bad practice and create a reusable function that will allow me to just call this one thing across wherever I need it, and it will handle all of the work for me. So there's still work that needs to be done with it, obviously. Like I said, I didn't actually complete anything. There have been no commits made, there have been no pushes done, but at least the core part of the code to handle that functionality is complete. There's of course some still tweaks I need to do, and I kind of want to refactor it a little bit. This whole project, this whole like side tangent I'm going down is an entire refactor in and of itself. But I'm basically doing a refactor within a refactor, if that makes any sense. So currently it's taking in like a bunch of parameter arguments in order to draw out the grid, and it works, but it's a little cumbersome and not quite as, I guess, developer friendly as I would like it to be. So, my next kind of plan to make this better is to basically create some kind of struct or class or something in order to basically contain all of this information, and then I can just pass that structure or that struct or class or whatever I end up making into the function as a parameter, and then that way I don't have to worry about, add if I need to change parameters, I don't have to worry about changing the function declarations or anything like that. I basically can make a change to the struct or the class or whatever I end up making, adding whatever additional variables I need in there, and then setting them accordingly where it's actually needed. So that's kind of what is on task next. But as it currently stands, like I said, it does technically work, but it is a very hacky solution. And the way that you know it's a hacky solution is, well, I guess there's a couple ways you know it's a hacky solution, but one of them is when you compile it with like all the warnings enabled, it throws a let's just say it throws a few of them. Some of the more notable ones are, I'm basically hard setting a size for the array, like by initializing an array with brackets, which C++ doesn't like when you do that with numbers that aren't constant from at compile time. It does not like that. For obvious reasons, of course, because you never know how big the data is going to come in as, and because you're doing that bracket creation, you're basically creating it on the stack. So because you don't know how big that value could be, there is an absolutely a chance that you could essentially overflow the stack and crash the program. Is it very likely? Probably not, especially in my use case, but it is still technically possible to do. So that's kind of one of the reasons why that it's throwing the warning. So let this be I guess a reminder that just because you get warnings um, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be issues, but at the same time, it's not necessarily something you should ignore either. My kind of personal design philosophy with this project has been I don't want any warnings during the compiling. I don't want any memory errors during the runtime. I don't want any memory leaks. And I basically want to just have this as pristine as I possibly can make it because, in part, one, this is just a fun hobby project for me. But two, I guess you could say, I don't know what the proper term would be, but I guess it would be like some people when they like write books or plays or songs or something, they're basically writing it for themselves, like as a love letter to themselves or something like that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's kind of sort of what this project is for me. Because one, how long I've been working on it. Two, the massive scope of it. It's by far the biggest project that I've really worked on and kind of stuck with for this long. I mean, it blew the most lines of code I wrote for a single project out of the water years ago. So, and it continues to grow and get larger. So yeah, I don't remember the exact tally of how many lines of code we're at. I haven't ran that script in a while against the code base, but I think we're at least in like the hot, like at least from what I remember, I think we're at least over 18,000. Like, I think we're probably getting close to like the 20,000 lines of code number. Now, granted, that 20,000 lines of code, give or take, isn't strictly just the C++ code for the video game itself. That also includes all the like other helper scripts that I've written as well. So I've written a handful of like Python scripts to help with various processes for like the basically to make my life easier. I wrote a Python script. One that I've documented a while ago on the podcast was creating Xcode projects based on the basically run a Python script and it'll create the Xcode project for you and set everything up the way it should be. That was one. Set up another one to basically download the correct version of Raylib and kind of put it in the right place for the project to work. And then there's been kind of some other odds and ends ones. Was one, I think, where I was basically taking the map of key bindings from the raylib.h file and basically converting that to, I think it was like a map or something, and basically auto-generating the code, the C++ code for that. So anytime there's a new Raylib update, I can basically run that script. It'll auto-generate the code for me, and I can basically compare it or just copy and paste it in where I need it, so I don't have to go through the tedious process of manually checking those things. So that's very nice. And then there are some bash scripts and other things too. So it's not strictly just C++ code, but of course the vast majority of the code in the project is C++. I'm looking at my GitLab right now for it, and C++ makes up 91.7% of the code in the repository. C makes up 3.9%, and then Makefile is 2.1, Python is 1.9, and then Bash is 0.2. So obviously seriously C dominated. And that does actually remind me of another thing that's in the project repo. The other thing in the repo is the asset compiler that I wrote, which basically takes all like currently it's just image files and I think fonts at the moment. But as I add other things into it for assets like videos or music, for instance, that's also going to be included in there. But basically what the asset compiler does is it goes in and basically checks, it basically auto-generates header files so I can embed the assets into the binary itself. That basically kind of taps into Raylib has some functions in its API to basically convert text or fonts and images and videos and music and that kind of a thing into header files, which is very nice and works very well. So I basically kind of wrote a simple C program to handle all that for me and kind of incorporated that into my build process. So that's other lines of source code that's included in the larger like 20,000 ish lines of code. So it's like I said, it's not all specifically for the project, but if you think about it, if you take like the 20,000 ish lines of code and then you multiply that by the percentage of C, which is basically 92%, it's still like a serious amount being strictly just C++. But anyway, I don't know really how we got onto that tangent. But I guess we did. But yeah, that's the nerdy things that I got up to this week and kind of what the I guess the plans are going forward. So, getting into the meat and potatoes of the episode, this whole age verification stuff and why it's bad for the internet. So, at the core of it, it makes some sense, right? Like, obviously, you don't want children viewing certain content that is on the internet, because if you've been around the internet for a while, you know that there is some very messed up stuff on the internet and definitely some things that children should not be looking at. But there's different ways that you can go about preventing kids from viewing these things. Now, granted, just like everything in the IT world, there is no silver bullet when it comes to this stuff. It does not matter if you create your own DNS rules to prevent your kids from viewing this stuff. There are things like VPNs that exist that can allow them to bypass your restrictions. There are things like Tor that exist that allow them to bypass your restrictions. There are proxies. There are many different ways that they can get around your restrictions that you put in place to access things that they probably shouldn't be accessing or that you don't necessarily want them to access. So I guess this is where the good old government comes in to come save the day, because obviously when the government says we're from the government, we're here to help, that's always a great sign. You love to see it. So basically their solution to this problem is sites that children shouldn't have access to. Well, the way you can ensure that children don't access it is you verify the age of everyone accessing the site to make sure that no one is a child, which on the surface kind of makes sense, I guess. And in the past, this has basically existed in a check the box to confirm that you're, over the age of 13 in the case of like Facebook back when they kind of checked that. And then there's, of course, other sites as well that, would have similar check boxes. But that was kind of the quote unquote age verification in the past, or the other kind of quote unquote age verification they would do would be ask you to give them your birthday, and then based on your birthday, they would determine on if you are basically over the age of 18 or not. So for instance, like YouTube age restricts some of their videos, and the way that you can get around it is if you have an account set up and you have your birthday set to you being over the age of 18, then you can then view those videos. So that was kind of historically how it was done. But obviously that's not good enough, because it's very easy to lie about that stuff. So the way that you can prevent that is by forcing people to verify and validate that they are actually the age that they say they are. Now, there's of course a few different ways that you can do this, but one of the most common ways that sites verify folks' identities is by you taking a picture of your photo ID and then taking a picture of yourself, and you basically submit that, and then it's typically like a couple day process for like a human review, basically just to look at the ID, look at your picture, be like, yes, this is the same person, and then they can verify your age that way. Now, some of these sites will claim that they delete this information, like they'll delete your once they verify your age, they will delete that information after a set amount of time. Yeah, good luck verifying that, because there are things called backups that exist, and once something is on the internet, it's not truly gone. Because if you think about how most businesses operate, yes, they might not actively have access to it anymore, but depending on what their retention is for either logs or backups or whatever, it's probably still kicking around somewhere. Um, Plus, there also might be the case. I haven't looked into the laws specifically. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but it wouldn't surprise me if some of the government agencies that are enacting these kinds of rules and restrictions might come to these sites and be like, "Hey, we want to do a quality control check of sorts to make sure that you're following the rules. So let's see the IDs of your users to make sure you're actually verifying people." In which case, they wouldn't actually be able to delete your ID, because then if the government came knocking and asking for that, they would be kind of out of luck. So this kind of all, according to the Verge article, kind of stems from a UK implementation of this that I guess just got implemented within like the past week and a half or so. Um, so various kind of like social media sites and other sites are now being required to verify that users are over the age of 18. And as we've kind of already discussed, there's really only one way to do that, and it's by basically taking a government ID and basically verifying the person that way. I suppose there's also, if you live in a state that deal or a country that has something like a social security card, which, remember guys, the social security card and social security number is not a personal identifying number. Yes. Even though it is very much used as one, it is not. The jokes. But theoretically, if you had one, that could potentially link to, how old you are. But yeah, like I said, typically it's through some kind of government issued ID, usually like a driver's license or a passport or something like that. Um, and like I mentioned, it's the problem with it is the privacy aspect. Like, the whole point of the internet back in the day, in the old days of the internet, and anonymity was basically the norm. It wasn't the exception. It was the norm, and it was basically expected that you could essentially do whatever you wanted to and nobody would know who you actually are. Now, even back then, there were still, tactics people could use to essentially de-anonymize people. One of the most common ways is you could find someone's IP address, and then based off that, you could do some spelunking to figure out where they are, and then you could maybe figure out who their ISP is, and then through some other looking about where the geolocation of the IP is, you might also be able to figure out the address, and then you could figure out who lives there, and bada bing, bada boom, you de-anonymize someone. And that definitely has happened before throughout the history of the internet. But that obviously takes a lot more skill than hacking into hacking into a database does take a lot of skill. Well, I guess it depends on the vulnerability though. But once that data is out there, it's out there. The cat's out of the bag. Pandora's box has been opened. You cannot put the cat back in the bag. You cannot reclose Pandora's box once it is opened. So once that data has leaked out onto the dark web, it is there and it is not going anywhere. So anyone that gets a hold of this data can then have access to all of these government records of people's photo IDs, linking them directly to probably other additional information, like most likely either at the very least, some kind of login credential, whether that's a username or even an email. And then based off of that, you can then cross-reference that with other database breaches to find other instances of that email being used or that username being used. And then because of one leak, you now have access potentially to a all these users that put in their photo ID into this basically age verification system. Everyone that verified themselves and put their photo ID in there, all those users and all of their logins, you can now cross reference with every single other data breach that has ever existed and figure out what accounts they own, what websites they're on, and everything. And you can build a really strong profile about what that person gets up to. And if that doesn't scare you, well, that's basically what the reality will be with these age verification laws, especially if they become more widespread to more services. Now, some of the sites it makes sense for, like for instance, like banking or financial sites, for protection against fraud and stuff, it does kind of make sense that you would want to have some sort of verification of the person's identity, but that's a little bit different than an age verification thing. That's just kind of making sure that you're actually who you say you are, so you're not, committing fraud, which is obviously a crime. So kind of the other aspect of this, we talked about the data breach portion of it, but the other portion of it too is the surveillance aspect of it, because because the second it's like when you log into an account with with your credentials from, say, a VPN, you instantly de-anonymize yourself by doing that, because when you say you go to a website, say you go to Facebook, and you've never gone to Facebook before with the VPN IP address you're connecting to. You go to Facebook, and Facebook doesn't know who this IP address is. The instant you log in, they know exactly who you are and what you're up to, because they're like, "Oh, this is, say, coming from a data center somewhere, and it's an IP address owned by this VPN company, and this user just logged into it, so that means they're using this VPN to access our network, and they can kind of gather that information about you." Now, kick that up to 11 when you have to fully de-anonymize yourself by uploading your government ID. Now, not only do social media companies can do all this trickery, but any of these other sites that require a photo ID and for the age verification now can do the exact same thing. So for other sites that you might have had to create an account on and you wanted to be like anonymous, like I think one of the a couple of the other sites that were listed on the Verge article was Reddit and Discord. Now, Reddit and Discord are pretty common for people liking to be anonymous on them, and not necessarily giving away their true identity. Well, if you have to upload your photo ID to it, well, now Reddit knows exactly who you are, and they can get together with some of their other buddies in the tech industry, and maybe they can do some data sharing with the various. But I guess the other thing too is the data brokers that exist out there, they're going to have an absolute field day with this, because now they can basically gather data from all of these big tech companies that are going to be requiring age verification on their sites, and they can basically conglomerate all that into a very, very, very personal profile on every single person that has given their information to them. So it's it's just asking for like the surveillance state to come to the masses. Now, it's of course it already exists in certain countries. Everyone kind of knows about what goes on in China and whatnot. But now imagine that for the rest of the world. So imagine, because you had to give some kind of age verification, a lot of your traffic will now be completely de-anonymized. And theoretically, I guess if someone wanted to, they could track to see what kind of search queries you're making, what kind of websites you're going to, and maybe that impacts stuff. I don't know. But that's technically a possibility if you have to upload your photo ID to sites, because even without, so if you take the photo ID out of it, there is still the plausible deniability factor that that account technically wasn't you because you didn't actually verify yourself that it was you. Now, in certain cases, like say with Facebook or something, or Instagram, if you're posting pictures of yourself and whatnot, it technically, I guess you could make the argument that maybe someone else stole those pictures somehow and was pretending to be you, I guess. But the second you kind of validate your identity with a photo ID, it makes it a lot tougher of a sell, to kind of get away with that. So really, the core issue that I have with the age verification stuff is there are way more privacy risks and just general cybersecurity malpractices than actual problems that get solved, at least in my opinion. Because, like I said, you're just asking for misuse of people's personal data. You're just asking for super in-depth profiles, even more than what already currently exists, to be made for people, and it's just I just don't think it is a very good idea. Now, again, I'm of course coming from this from a very cynical cybersecurity background, so I kind of understand some of this stuff. But like I said, like if you're just looking at the high level, if you just listen to, I guess, the marketing pitch of the laws and stuff, it sounds like a good idea. But as we've been kind of discussing, once you really dig into what's really going on behind the scenes and what the potential ramifications are of laws like this, the idea of maybe of this is something that I want, at least for I think me for sure, goes down significantly. Um, because I guess it's we talked about the trolley problem not too long ago. It's like the trolley problem, right? As it currently stands, people and potentially children are negatively affected by the internet not verifying people's ages, which is obviously not a good thing. But if you add this whole like age verification thing, you potentially cause even more people to be severely negatively impacted by the internet and all of the nefarious things that will go on behind the scenes. So what do you do? Is it goes back to the, I guess, the ethics debate there. Um, and the thing that really the main reason that I want to drive home why I think this is a bad idea is the whole data breach concept of it, because we have, how many data breaches have there been in recent years from some very large and otherwise reputable companies and institutions that have had significant data breaches occur? And obviously that's really bad because things like people's personal information is in there, things like social security numbers might be in there, passwords, login credentials, that kind of stuff. And that is, don't get me wrong, that is very, very bad. But the second you throw in additional information like government IDs, for instance, that just kind of turns it up to 11 because, like, I mean, I guess on the social security number aspect of it, like, I mean, that's pretty bad for, you can steal someone's identity with that for sure. But if you have like a full, like, good essentially scan of someone's like driver's license, for instance, that's a lot, I think, a lot easier to kind of pass off as a like legitimate way of stealing someone's identity than just entering in a social security number into a site. Because typically, right, like when you do one of these verifications with a government ID, they make you like take a scan of it and then upload it. So obviously it's not like a social security number where you could maybe get lucky and just guess the number. Like you actually have to upload physical proof that you have the photo ID. And a lot of the time when you have these age verification things or just validation of identity in general, they not only make you upload a picture of the photo ID, but they also make you upload a picture of you. to make sure and basically be able to correlate to make sure that, yes, this is the same person. So if the photo of you and your photo ID is in the database breach, well, guess what? Now someone can take both of those pieces of information and go steal your identity willy-nilly because they can prove, like, look, this is a picture of me that I just took, and this is my ID. Look, I am who I say I am. And then you kind of mix that with some other information that you might have found through your dark web pillaging. And yeah, people's identities are for sure going to be stolen by this. And not to mention the fact that people's anonymity is going to be destroyed even more than it already is, which personally I don't like. Now, let's be very clear here. It's not like just because you don't use a social media account means that you're completely anonymous on the internet. That's not how this works. We have seen time and time again of individuals being de-anonymized on Tor, no less. The infamous Tor network, the one that's supposed to allow you complete anonymity, that nobody knows who you are and you can do whatever you want and you won't get caught. People have been de-anonymized on Tor. Now, granted, a lot of the cases are due to OPSEC failures, but it's not always OPSEC failures. Now, again, OPSEC being operational security, basically the idea that you let some personal information slip that can allow someone to essentially de-anonymize you in this case. So, say if you're on the dark web and you're doing your dark web things, and then you give like a little bit of personal information out about yourself. Maybe you accidentally drop what your real first name is or something. That little tidbit can send internet sleuths and especially federal agents down a rabbit hole to de-anonymize you and figure out who you are. So there are absolutely ways that you can be de-anonymized even if you think you're being anonymous. And as much as VPN companies like to claim that you can be anonymous on the internet, they're just full of you know what, because as we've already discussed, the second you log into a site with your credentials, the site knows exactly who you are. There's no fooling that you're using a different IP address. They can tie all that information right back to you. So let's see, what else should we talk about on why this is bad? I think a lot of it also comes down to there is I guess we'll say that there is not the highest tech literacy rate amongst the individuals that are making these laws. I guess that is what we can say. Um, but the other thing that's also kind of dumb about them is, like we discussed at the very beginning of this, when we talked about how, like, if you set up your own like safety barriers to prevent, say, your kids from accessing sites that you don't want them to access through things like blocking DNS queries, there are ways to get around this. So VPNs are a fantastic way to get around this. I know I kind of clowned on them for not actually being anonymous, but one thing that VPNs are very good for is bypassing geo blockers. So, for instance, if you like to, say, stream things, there is a chance that depending on where you live, you might not have access to certain content. But if you use a VPN to basically pretend like you're in a different country, well, guess what? Now you can have access to that content. One thing not too long ago, back when the 24 Hours of Le Mans was airing, that was geo-restricted depending on what site you were trying to access to watch the race. But guess what? If you used a VPN to say you're, say, from the UK or Europe or something and you actually live in the US, well, guess what? The stream works now. Because the vast majority of the, I guess, the logic, if you will, to basically check if these restrictions are in place is based on your IP address and where they think you're coming from. Because typically, that's a pretty good way to tell where someone is from based on their IP address. Now, you can also do other things to kind of bypass that, like if the device in question has GPS. on it, you could potentially maybe try to tap into that, but that's a lot harder to do if you're like, say, a website, for instance. So the best way, if you're a website, to basically try to figure out where someone is from is to take their IP address, do kind of a lookup, see where that IP address is coming from, and then implement your restrictions, if there are any, based on their IP address. So it doesn't matter if there's age restrictions in some countries, but not others, because you can just tunnel into a different country through a VPN, and congratulations, you just bypassed all the restrictions. So yeah, there are ways to get around these types of restrictions and laws that get put in place. Now, because I'm not a lawyer, this is not legal advice, but I'm not, because I'm also technically not sure if that violates, maybe that violates the law. I don't know. Um, how they would know that you were doing that. I mean, I guess if they wanted to, theoretically, I guess they could. If they were checking, who was accessing the site, and they did some correlating, they might be able to see, like, oh, you were connecting to a VPN provider. Maybe they tried to seize information from your ISP or something, logs from your ISP, and saw you were connected to a VPN provider that was outside the country. And I don't know, maybe they saw that you had an account. Somehow they knew what your login credentials were, and saw that there was activity on your account between the dates that they got the logs that you were tunneled in through the VPN, and maybe they get you that way. I don't know. But so technically, I guess if that is a crime, that using a VPN violates their laws or whatever, then I guess do it at your own risk. I do, obviously, in that case, I wouldn't endorse it. But the thing of it, that's just kind of the point, though. It The thing with this kind of a, I guess, a law, in my opinion, is people are going to get around it. If the people that want to access the content without the age restriction are going to find a way to do it. That's just kind of the reality of the matter. So you're really only forcing the, I guess, the less tech savvy people that don't know how to get around the restrictions. You're basically just punishing them by letting everyone else go about their merry way and not having to deal with it. This is kind of what the thing is at the end of the day. At the end, so that kind of brings up the point of what is the point of this? Because if you're trying to restrict the people that really want to access these types of sites, well, either they'll see the age restriction thing and either just give up and be like, it's not worth it, I don't need to actually go to this site anymore, or two, they still really want to access the site. They're tech savvy enough and they get around your restrictions. Or three, they just kind of get suckered in and now they have to face the consequences. But for the people in the second category, or I guess the first category, I forget which order I put them in, the category of those that don't know how to bypass the restrictions and don't care enough about accessing the site, so they just give up. Depending on what the site's business model is, that technically could seriously impact their bottom line, depending on how many users they lose due to these age restrictions. Depending on, the sheer volume of traffic they get, maybe that's a lot of people, maybe that's not a lot of people. I think for some sites it's going to be less of a big deal than others, like maybe a site like Discord or Reddit, for instance, where some of the populace is potentially a little more maybe less so Reddit, but where some of the populace is a little more tech savvy and can figure out ways to skirt around these age verification restrictions. Maybe it won't impact them as much, and they'll still kind of get the traffic that they're usually getting. But then your whole law and rule kind of is pointless at that point, because it's not actually really doing anything. So yeah, like I said, those that know how to bypass the restrictions will bypass the restrictions. So the only people that you're really hurting are those that don't know how to bypass the restrictions, or you potentially could be hurting the sites themselves by those that don't have a desire to give up their personal information just to access this site, so they no longer use the site and go find a different alternative, which is definitely probable. And if you are out there and you don't know how to get around these kinds of age verification restrictions, if you are faced with them, my recommendation is to no longer use that site, because personally, I don't think it's worth giving up that much personal information just to access the site. I don't really care what the site is. It's like 99% of the time not worth you giving up that much personal information to access. And I'm sure there are other alternatives that you could use, potentially, or maybe that's just not something you need anymore. But yeah, so between the reducing the privacy, completely de-anonymizing people, and the sheer likelihood that massive identity theft is inevitable because of this, I think it is a horrible idea that these things exist. But I'd be interested to hear what you all think. So if you have any takes on age verification restrictions across the internet, let me know if you're on YouTube in the comments down below, or if you're listening on podcast, you can of course email me at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. But to wrap up this episode, let us get back to our trivia question for the week. So this week's trivia question is: when CrowdStrike took down the internet last year, it was due to a bad configuration file update to their endpoint detection and response agent, which caused blue screens of death on Microsoft Windows machines, disrupting millions of Windows computers worldwide. But what was the name of that agent software? So again, what was the name of CrowdStrike software that took down the internet last year? If you said Falcon, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share it with a friend or family member if you enjoyed it. And if you have any questions or comments or ideas about this episode or for future episodes, you can either leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube, or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.